welcome to The Right Idea, where we discuss the people, policy, and politics that drive Texas. I'm your host, Brian Phillips. I'm the Chief Communications Officer at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And with me, as always, is my co-host, Derek Cohen. He's the Vice President of Policy at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Today with us, and we'll get to him in just a little bit, we're very excited as things move from sort of the legislative front and the policy front from our legislative sessions, and things are moving into more of the political season and the election season. We thought it'd be a great time to welcome one of TPPF's newest members. He's the director of our new election protection project. His name is Josh Findlay, and we'll introduce him a little bit later in the show. But we're very excited to talk about that because there's a lot of policy really that goes on around election reform, election integrity. There's a lot of crazy things that get said, a lot of debate around those issues and what they could mean. So we're excited to have him on because he has a very storied and historic resume, and so we're very excited to have him and talk to him today. But first, as always, we do a little bit of shameless self-promotion and kind of getting the ins and outs of what's going on, the insider look at what's happening up at the Capitol. And we do that with Derek's, of course, his legislative update. So we'll kick it over to you, Derek, for what's going on at the Capitol.
So correct me if I'm wrong. I believe we had our last recording the day before the school choice bill was on the floor. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah.
All right. Well, I think we all know what happened there. No, for those
take us through the gory details.
The gory details, indeed. So as you know, HB1 was on the floor. Obviously, those who carry water for the educator establishment, had sounded the alarm that we're going to get those nasty ESAs out of there. Hopefully, in them trying to preserve the financial component, where you're just a windfall for the district financial officers. Actually, some of it though at least would have gone to teachers. But again, I hasten to add that the state does not set teacher salaries,
right.
For the nth time. But that being said, that was what was on the floor the day after we recorded. What happened was there was a good amount of discussion, point of order here called, point of order there called, and then they came up with an amendment to actually strip out the education savings account component of that, right?
So take out the part that parents want and just leave in all the money for the districts.
Yeah, and to be honest with you, it was a very paltry part of a very expensive bill.
Mm-hmm.
I saw it referred to online. Somebody said that it's basically a school choice pilot project, which I think is a bit dismissive, but not entirely inaccurate. Just because of, again, this is a very toe dip in the water. If you look at both in terms of the overall statewide educational outlay as well as the number of kids that would be serviced, but again, it beats the heck out of nothing, right? And so, that was, and here's where it gets interesting. So that amendment gets proposed, that amendment gets stuck on. That then, again, not going into the entire parliamentary chicanery of this, but essentially they then ensconced it in a way that on second reading, it cannot be removed, say, from a reconsideration or something like that.
So they were successful in stripping out the ESAs and then basically locked it in that there was no way to prevent that.
And again, this is something that I've torn my hair out to, at the end of the regular session. We gone back and forth on was it HB 4390, wherein if something leaves, per the House's own rules, if something leaves the House, that expressly omits something and the Senate puts it back in, then it's per se out of order. This is, by the way, there's no precedent of this, and even in parliamentary circles. So this is just, we can do a whole separate episode on
right.
the House parliamentarians, I should say, but that's neither here nor there for this. Just suffice it to say that was pulled out, frozen, and then the author of the bill, Chairman Buckley, who I might have to add, deserves all the praise in the world for walking this narrow path between the advocates, the opponents, and so on and so forth, then pulled the bill down, recommitted it to his committee. It's still, so technically it's still active.
Yeah.
It could still pass. I just, as I've said here before, I don't know how you change that bill where these people that are so lashed to the mast on opposing any element of school choice because they feel it's their sacred ox getting gored. They're so lashed to the mast. I don't know don't know if there's any negotiating with those terrorists. So that being said, will it come up? It is possible. Is it probable? Absolutely not.
So the upshot is because the opponents of school choice, because the opponents of parent empowerment are so opposed to parents having a little more leverage to against the schools, or against, or at least a little more leverage to try and get the schools to be more responsive to them. They're so opposed to that they're willing to leave billions and billions and billions of dollars on the table, including teacher salaries and better benefits and things like that, because they're so opposed to the parent empowerment.
I mean, I think you're charitably stipulating to their talking point, because again, I seen a mailer that a particular candidate who is going to have some, let's just say an interesting winter, sent out saying, don't let them take your tax relief in the form of vouchers. This individual obviously voted against it. Of course, we can talk about how the Vaders already have taken tax relief in the form of vouchers. But all that to say is, again, this is not money for private schools. It's money for students. That might end up going to but it also goes co-curricular, supportive therapy, all these different things that the ESA covers, is essentially being reduced to this, which I think they've had to have message tested, because I'd certainly know that the legislators that are saying, oh, this is all money for private, they can't be that stupid. I mean, because, they tie their shoes every day. But that being said, that's where they're, again, lashed to the mast on, and now that's why we're seeing certain political ramifications arising from that.
I don't know. The Skechers have the new slip-ons, so we'll have to see who's wearing those.
Shout out Nike Flies.
Okay, so that's school choice. Yeah. It is. We don't want to say it's dead, but at this point, it certainly has moved over from.
It would take a Festivus miracle.
You take a miracle for this session, and then we'll see what happens next year. I mean, that's the other thing, is that there have been indications by both the governor and lieutenant governor of a willingness to do this again next year and call another special session. Again, as the governor said, the difference between this and a football game is that there's no time clock on special sessions, and he can call them whenever he wants to. So, all right, but we also, and before we get to Josh, because I definitely want to get into a deep discussion on our election integrity efforts, but talk to me a little bit about SB4 and the immigration law that is heading to the governor's desk.
Well, SB4, though, that actually, I mean, that's a, you said heading to the governor's desk. That's a success story. This was the one we discussed when we had Celine in here. This is the one that basically requires that, and again, we have to clarify, because everybody says that this is about targeting asylum seekers and anything. If a individual is illegally crossing between a point of entry, a port of entry, which is what crossing between a port of entry is per se illegal. Right. This would have them being DPS or local law enforcement take these individuals to a port of entry. Yeah, please point out to me where the problem is. But anyway,
law enforcement officers seeing somebody doing something illegal, stop them, arrest them, and take them to the port of entry.
Now imagine if somebody else
hand them over to the federal government.
Exactly. Imagine you have somebody else committing a crime, and all the police officer did was go, "Hey, go a block that way." So that's it. It's a ridiculous. I know we're going to talk about it a little bit more, but that's essentially the bill, and it's obviously being castigated as this. The nonsense you're about to talk about. Anyway, obviously the legislature seen that was a complete nonsense argument, sent it to the governor's desk. Look forward to seeing that signed very soon.
Right. I mean, that's a great way to explain it. Look, you have to be in the, for state and local law enforcement. I think, first of all, people will be amazed that state and local law enforcement are not allowed, that we even needed this law in the first place, that right now they're not allowed to see somebody breaking the law and then do something about it, which I think kind of blows people's minds that in 2023 we don't have that law on the books. But now that we do, the left is demonizing this, of course, as, oh, well, they're going to, this is going to give, DPS the right to go kick down grandma's door and start asking about her papers and all this. I mean, it's just complete demonizing, fear-mongering nonsense.
That's all they got, though.
Right. And so, and in a way to escalate this, of course, because now, because they're fear-mongering all this, we had an article come out in which the left admitted, some Democrats admitted something, which I thought was very interesting. The chair of the Mexican-American Legislative Caucus, who is a Democrat, she said that, quote, we met with several of the Mexican consuls here in Dallas, as well as 11 Mexican consuls from across the state. So they met with the Mexican government. In partnership, we will be putting together informational and town halls across the state to educate our community about the impact of Senate Bill 4. So in essence, they're going to be working with the Mexican government to undermine and attack SB4, which is the law which allows local and state law enforcement to essentially do their job. So
the cartel suffused Mexican government,
right? So the cartel, and of course the Mexican government is effectively a cartel syndicate at this point. They're doing the agenda of the cartels. They work hand in hand to thwart border security efforts at the border. And now you have politicians within our own state now colluding with the Mexican government / cartels to undermine the very laws we're trying to use to protect these communities. And they're going to be going into these communities attacking these laws. So just wanted to highlight that was a maybe an unwitting omission on their part, that they're going to be working essentially with the Mexican government and the cartels to undermine Texas law. But I think it's stunning.
Yeah, well, as I say, I think I'm just getting to a point of cynicism in this particular role where, I'm like, that's eyebrow raising, but I wouldn't say shocking anymore, And then, obviously, when you start down, I mean, it's probably a product of the political moment we're in, to be honest with you, where everything you don't like is racist. Remember, every government that is doing something you don't like, it's fascist. It's this lack of creative imagination in the mind of the left, where they have like 3 words that they can use to describe something, and if something doesn't neatly fit in one of those shoe boxes, they just rip out the side of the shoebox and try it anyway.
All right. Well, if you haven't had your daily dose of cynicism enough yet, we're going to get into an issue which may heighten that a little bit. But we definitely want to get to Josh Findlay. Again, Josh Findlay is the director of TPPF's new National Election Protection Project, and he's the former National Director of Election Integrity at the Republican National Committee. He served as legal counsel to presidential campaigns, where he has run an election integrity war room from the White House, served as senior advisor to the campaign's election integrity program, and built out the campaign's legal network. Josh, welcome to The Right Idea.
Thank you, Brian and Derek. It's great to be here with you.
And I will mention that Josh is remote with us. He's in DC, works from our offices there in DC. So thank you for being remote. This is great. This is new technology. We're innovating, Derek. This is new.
We used to just set up a scarecrow and put his headshot on it, but
we've evolved in our technology. So let's get to Josh. I want to get into this because there are a lot of issues, but first I want you to kind of set it up for us. This is a new initiative by the Texas Public Policy Foundation. We've worked on election integrity issues here in Texas and worked on some things, but now this is a real national initiative. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're focused on and what you're hoping to achieve?
Sure. Happy to. No, Texas Public Policy Foundation has a great history of working on election integrity. The organization was very fundamental in getting Texas's election integrity bill passed a couple of years ago. And what we really want to do is expand a lot of the best practices that we're seeing here in Texas to key states across the country. And we're primarily going to be working in the states that everybody knows have a history of election integrity issues. We'll be working in Georgia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Arizona, Nevada, and then of course in our own backyard there in Texas. And what we're really going to be focused on is focusing on election integrity issues that keep people from voting. Right there in your backyard of Harris County, all those issues about machines not functioning properly, running out of ballots, people not being able to vote because of long lines, things like that. Those are the process issues that we're really focused on, that we've determined are the things that really keep people from voting. And that's what we want to fix.
So I want to go to I want to start here because I think it's really important that we're all on the same page. I read a recent article in which you all were announcing this initiative from the Daily Signal. And this is how you defined election integrity, which I think is a really important place, because I think, because what it means to have integrity in your elections could mean different things to different people. I think it's a really important place to start. You said this: we're looking at 3 things defining election integrity. 1, can the election integrity system accurately identify the people who are going to vote? So 1, can we identify the people who are going to vote? Are they who they say they are? 2, can they confirm that they're eligible to vote in that election? Because just because you say you are who you are doesn't mean that you should be able to vote for that congressman or for those state reps. And then 3, can we securely collect and accurately count the ballots that are going to be processed? So once we know who you are, once we know that you're eligible to vote in that election, and then you vote, can we collect them securely and accurately count them so that everybody's voice is heard? That is a great definition. Talk to me a little bit about why you focus on those issues and how that informs kind of your policy recommendations and the things that you're looking for in some of these other states.
Absolutely. So coming out of the 2020 election, there was a lot of doubt, a lot of confusion, a lot of mistrust about the election process. And a lot of that was the result of these last minute changes that states were making because of COVID, right? Some of them were done by legislatures, some of them were done by executive authority. We can talk about how correct legally any of those things were. But the result was these last minute changes led to confusion about who was voting, whether they were eligible to vote, whether people had already cast ballots, things like that. That doubt and mistrust cannot exist in our election process because that leads to doubt and mistrust in the results. And as you can see across the country, we're still paying the price for those last minute changes in 2020. There is still a significant portion of the population that doesn't trust our elections. And we've got to go back and start with the basics to provide confidence in the process.
And Josh, I think you bring up a really good point because about the undermining of confidence and trust. And, we've been very, forthcoming on here is saying there's a phenomenon that exists on both sides. That needs to be called out, specifically because I remember starting back in 2016. We had the pre-criminations coming out of the Clinton campaign about the actual results, and then of course, obviously, as Governor Stacey Abrams of Georgia would tell you, there was obviously some undermining and some wish casting in the Georgia elections as well, and that's why it's one of them is on the list. So I think that we, as Americans, all agree that having a having an election that both parties can trust is of ultimate importance. Now, the problem, of course, and where I think the argument comes a little bit off the rails, is when people selectively apply that which they call animating principles, right? For example, they would say, oh, well, there was voter suppression in X district because this happened. And then you point out, well, it happened in that one as well, or this district as well. And it turns out like one's for one party and one's for the other. Mm-hmm. What do you see, John, as kind of how do you see the path to return to normalcy, as it were, in the election space?
Well, that's a great question, Derek. I think a major issue here is that we see the election process as a political activity, right? The actual casting of votes as a political activity. And therefore, we fight about certain mechanical things that should be common sense, right? So if you look at Luzerne County and what happened there in the 2022 election, the county just ran out of ballots. People weren't allowed to cast votes because they ran out of ballots. It seems absurd that that would be the case. But then you go and look at what happened in Northampton County, Pennsylvania, a couple of weeks ago in their municipal election, and they had machines that were flipping votes. A lot of these things that are creating this confusion could be easily preventable by looking at our elections more as a series of transactions than as a political activity. We spend money electronically and by paper and by card every day. Companies process millions of transactions, and we have confidence in those transactions because of the processes that are checked ahead of time. But we don't do the same thing in our elections. We fight over these processes when there should be objectively best practices like having enough paper in place, checking your machines, making sure that you know exactly who is voting and how many votes they are casting and things like that. These things that should be common sense that we're just fighting over. If we could get back to an ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure in our election process, I think we'll be in good shape.
And that's one of the things I want to explore, because that's a really important point, is that if you can do these reforms on the front end and make these changes on the front end to make the elections more secure, you don't have all of that wrangling after the votes are counted, right? Because then, if the votes are counted and it goes a certain way, but then they find out that some machines weren't working or that certain people weren't allowed to vote, and now they should be able to cast their ballots because they, after the fact, because they weren't allowed to cast them on election day, and then it changes the outcome, then that's when you have all of the conspiracy theories flying and all of that. And to your point, like how important is that we, work on this now? I mean, that's one of the reasons why I think, we've started this initiative now, is because we need to fix these reforms in the context of just getting the election day right versus trying to change it after the fact whenever we see all of the problems. So one of the things I want to ask you about in that regard is, this isn't a 50 state initiative. You have picked these particular states. Is it because necessarily that they're battleground states and that they could go one way or the other and tip the election and have the most impact? Excuse me. Or is it because these are states that have had problems in the past and need the most attention, or maybe a little bit from column A and a little bit from column B?
So I would say primarily we chose these states because they're states with a history of election issues. If you look back, 4 to 5 years in all of these states, they have had histories of problems counting votes, of machines functioning properly, of things like that. Now, it matters the most in these states because by definition, a battleground state is a state where the race will be close and every vote counts. And we want to make sure that we are monitoring the votes that count the most, the closest. As we know, these states are going to be the ones that decide the presidential election. And no matter how that election turns out, we want to know that the process was followed correctly and that we can trust the results.
Derek, from your perspective, not a lot of election integrity stuff going on this session, but that was probably the number one issue for the last session in 2021. How is Texas doing? Has it essentially fixed? I mean, I guess obviously there's some issues with Harris County and maybe some localized places, but where do you think Texas stands in terms of its overall election integrity?
Let us immortalize that. You said there's some issues with Harris County.
It's just the third largest county in America.
Yeah. Well, no, you're exactly right. So obviously, we're a biennial legislature. So, the long wave of COVID had not crested until the 21 session. But as we saw with, that was a very, very contentious bill. And when I say contentious, I mean not on what it actually did. It didn't really do anything, outside norm. It just said, hey, you're going to abide by the election law that's already on the books. You're not going to be able to rewrite things on the fly. And so on and so forth. But of course, that's what led to the historic quorum. I shouldn't say historic; they've pulled that nonsense before. But it's what led to the quorum break. People walking out on their jobs, and at the end of the day, the same bill ended up passing.
A little bit stronger, actually, prior to the quorum break.
Exactly, because I think it also people got a little bit tired of dealing with that nonsense, and so. That was, I would say, the Ragnarok over election in Texas. Now, interestingly enough, Georgia was one of the ones that went through first. Remember, for their particular election integrity bill, they lost the MLB All-Star Game in Atlanta. You had Joe Biden out there calling it, was it Jim Eagle? Or what have you?
Yeah, Biden.
Yeah. Sorry, Biden out there, and because yes, apparently an eagle is a greater form of crow. I'll have to. I watch a lot of Always Sunny in Philadelphia, but I don't know if they weigh into that in the crow stuff. But that being said, is they kind of took a lot of the national heat for that. But what we saw in Georgia, what we saw in Texas, was not only did the voter rolls grow, I don't want to say exponentially, but grow from that. We saw a larger percentage voting after that. So if this was supposedly a exercise in voter suppression, it came about the exact opposite result. Now, maybe that's because people saw this and they were more engaged, whatever the case might be. But let's just say that the recriminations from folks on the left who think that showing an ID is the second coming of the Reichstag,
right?
It never came into being. So what we saw this session, and a little bit in the subsequent sessions. A little bit in session subsequent to 21 was a little bit of nibbling around the edges. Remember, we talked about Chairman Betancourt's bill about a person can't live in a post box, things like that. But basically,
turns out,
basically just things like things like that. So I would say not the omnibus level thing that we had in 21, but more of the tightening up the edges. But like this, we did have a couple election bills, I would say, go through the legislature, or should I say attempt to go through the legislature, one including ranked choice voting. But we really didn't see anything that I would consider titanic. But I would like to take that opportunity, if you don't mind, and ask Josh. So, Josh, ranked choice voting seems to be a hot topic. I've seen it considered basically the panacea of any form of civic strife that comes about from political disagreement. Can you give us kind of a 30,000-foot view of what ranked choice voting is, how it works, and then kind of give us an assessment of, does it solve these problems?
Sure. So ranked choice voting is a system where instead of getting a ballot and you make your selection, the person that you want to vote for, and then you submit that ballot and all the ballots are tallied at the end of the election.
And this is across per race.
Yes, per race. Essentially what happens in ranked choice voting is you've got a list of all the candidates that are running for that office, and you rank them in order. You fill in a circle for your top choice, and then a second choice and a third choice, and so on, all the way down the ballot. And what gets tricky here essentially is how the counting happens. Because as they tally the votes, if your candidate does not rank high enough in the tally as they're counting the choices, those candidates drop off. And so as people, make all of the selections, for example, their votes get dropped off as the counting happens. And the confusion here is that people don't understand how ranked choice voting happens. They don't understand how it works. And if you look at the studies, and what has happened in practice up in Alaska, it really benefits, it disenfranchises a lot of voters, and it benefits people who can profit off the confusion of the voting process.
And one of the things that I've heard is that and again, I'm well receptive to any data that suggests this, but I just haven't seen it, that it enforces and rewards moderation in political discourse. Is that true?
I would say it, not necessarily moderation in political discourse, but what I would say is it consolidates people toward the middle, right? Because the farther that you get from being a mainstream candidate, the less people know your name. And so those people just don't get votes at the end of the day. And I think those votes should and would be counted under another political system.
I just think it's purely undemocratic. I mean, if you have an election and you have certain people, you have a number of people who make it onto the ballot, that's the election. And I go in and I make my one choice among those individuals for that election. And then if you don't get 50 plus 1%, then you have a runoff. And then you have another election where you have to show up again. And if the rules are that you've limited to those top two people, then great. I can go in making that educated choice. But the idea that, my third or fourth choice would ultimately be the one that gets scored for me making that vote. I mean, no, I went into that election and I chose that first person, and that's who I wanted in that election to be the governor or whoever. The fact that the process would then score my vote as somebody that I picked third or fourth or fifth is just absurd. I mean, the whole notion of it's just absurd.
Well, no, and I appreciate you flagging the runoff, because that's one of the usual things that I've heard about this. Oh, well, imagine all this money we're saving for, because now the people that advocate ranked choice voting let's just not say that they're fiscal hawks, okay? But the folks that tend to be calling for that, say, oh, well, it's time and money that costs the county. But if you look at implementing a new voting system, educating the public, and then, as we've seen in many cases, the litigation that usually follows because you've seated the wrong candidates has happened before. Mm-hmm. Essentially, any of those those marginal cost improvements are completely wiped out. Mm-hmm. And so it's one of these things where I think, and again, Josh, correct me if I'm wrong, but what I think all the hullabaloo behind ranked choice voting and the support behind it correctly diagnoses that we are lacking civility within our politics. I'll be the first to say. But then it prescribes a solution that not only will not solve that, because it comes from a completely different route than the ones that they actually want to acknowledge, but not only can be, but it comes with all these other unintended side effects for that. Like when you're watching TV, you hear these commercials about whatever this particular medication is, and it says, oh, your eyeball might fall out, and it might give you like advanced leprosy or something like that, and it's like, whoa, this just deals with shingles, man. Like I think that seems like a pretty downside risk, and so it's like, why, in some cases, why would you even bother bringing that in the first place when you have a system that largely works but gets blamed for a lot of external actors from that system?
Right, Josh. I mean, the criticisms are not about, the issue is not that we're spending too much money on elections. What the issue is that we need to get our elections right.
That's exactly right. I mean, the money is there. The money is there to finance all of the elections that we need to conduct across the country. We've just got to refine the process and make sure that it works better so that people have confidence.
Now, I want to get to a couple of hot button issues. Derek's already mentioned one of ranked choice voting, but before we do kind of rapid fire on that, just to ask you broadly, what do you think? I mean, now that you've kind of assessed this and we're going into these battleground states, what do you think generally is the biggest threat to the 2024 election in terms of the administration of it? What should be the things that people are really looking out for, even outside of these battleground states?
Well, so it's a really interesting question, Brian. I'm going to share something with you that not a lot of people know. But one thing that we did at the Republican National Committee last election cycle is we put 80,000 new poll workers and poll watchers in place across the country. It was something Republicans hadn't done before because we had confidence in the election process, but that changed after 2020. We gave these poll workers and poll watchers an issue reporting system, and they reported back over 25,000 issues across the 17 states that we targeted. What was fascinating to me was that in every state, the same 3 issues reported. Now, because of state laws, they could have manifested themselves in different ways. They could be in different orders in the states, but the same issues occurred across all states. And there were 3 things. First was issues with the ballots, like we talked about in Lucerne County, places running out of ballots, misprinting ballots, putting incorrect races on ballots, races that didn't actually have opponents or had already been decided on ballots. So incorrect ballots is the first thing that people really need to watch out for. If you're going in there on election day and you're trying to cast a vote, pay attention to every single race up and down the ballot to make sure you've got the right ballot. Second thing was issues with machines functioning properly. Now, let me be clear. I'm not talking about machines flipping votes. What I'm talking about is you go up to vote on election day, and the e-poll book doesn't work correctly. So you can't check in. Leads to long lines, right? The things like we saw in Maricopa County, where the ballots didn't match up with the scanners. So they couldn't scan the ballots properly, which led to people putting different ballots in different boxes, having to use provisional ballots, lines backing up out the door, all of that sort of thing. And then the last thing was meaningful observation for the absentee ballots. Shockingly, that is still an issue across the country. And again, it's not that people are seeing fraud. It's just that they're not being able to see what happens with the processing of these ballots.
Now, how do you go about fixing these issues? I mean, are these things that you can test before Election Day? Because all 3 things that you mentioned right now, I mean, you don't know you have a problem until you have a problem, and it's on Election Day. So how do you try to? I mean, is there a like a red team for this kind of thing that they can test and figure out, make sure it's going to work whenever they need it to work?
Well, Brian, that's exactly what we're advocating for, is going into these counties ahead of time, making sure that they are following first the state law, and second, just general best practices, because a lot of the solutions for these things should be common sense. Working with these counties, collaborating with them to make sure that they are following the best practices, that they're testing everything properly before Election Day, so that when they go into Election Day, everything's ready to go. This should all be taken care of ahead of time. And, a lot of proactive counties really are taking advantage of this. They're constantly refining their election processes, improving in really innovative ways. And the ones that don't are the counties where we still see all the issues.
So, Josh, you bring up a very good point about, this is a universal good, right? This isn't a, thing that benefits universally Republicans, benefits universally Democrats, but sanctity and security in our elections is something that's very important. And keep in mind, especially in Texas, we actually have a lot of individuals on our ballot that are nonpartisan. When we're talking about, someone running for city council or somebody running for mud board or, the board of the library district or something like that. This is a thing that is largely nonpartisan as well. I just wanted to add that. Now, we talked a lot about the actual casting of ballots being, kind of ground zero for a lot of your project. Let me ask, what are other issues? What are issues in the broader election space that you think could undermine the integrity of any future elections, or should I say things that have that potential if they haven't already?
Sure. So I think one thing that you have to look at is how ballots are being collected. Drop boxes, I would anticipate, are still going to be an issue this time around, specifically drop boxes that are not secured. One thing I'd like to share that I found to be kind of fascinating, we were up in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, doing some testing for their municipal elections. And if you remember, Pennsylvania is a county that has had notorious issues for unsecure drop boxes. And Bucks County specifically has faced a lot of criticism for what they did with their drop boxes. And I just want to highlight this county because I really saw a lot of improvement up there that was impressive. First of all, they only had 11 drop boxes across the county. Now, keep in mind, this is a populous county. It's a collar county to Philadelphia, and southern Bucks County really bleeds into Philadelphia. So they only had 11 drop boxes. They were all inside government buildings, so they were only open government hours. Not the 24-hour drop boxes that we saw in other places. They had a physical monitor there looking at everybody who was coming in to bring in a ballot, and a video monitor as well, so that they could provide instruction to people, let them know that, you're only allowed to cast one ballot, your ballot. And then if errors did happen, they were there to flag those issues to the county. So I think in places that are not implementing security best practices around drop boxes, that's something that we should be looking at closely. I think a lot of things you're going to see as well are the placement of voting centers. The way counties distribute where people are allowed to vote. I think that's going to be really interesting, placement on college campuses and in neighborhoods and things like that. So there's a lot of issues with government resources and how they're being used to influence the vote.
And since you won't do your own shameless promotion, I will do it for you. In today's Washington Times, Josh has a fantastic piece on the Bucks County issue. And you start with the story, and I think this is really important for everyone to understand, our listeners and viewers out there to understand that you start with the story of a woman who I think is the vice chair of the Democrat Party for the county, being on tape, stuffing dozens, if not hundreds of ballots into a box late at night. And so it called into question exactly what she was doing. And there's been an investigation into this. And this is what we're talking about. That they talk about these drop boxes. Oh, that they're making it more convenient. People don't have to stay in lines. They can get off of work, or they can drop their kids off and go vote real quick. And it seems like this noble purpose. And yet now we have this example of somebody in the county, at midnight, stuffing dozens, if not hundreds of ballots. So it does happen. It's not something that anyone's making up. It's not something that anyone's fabricating. That these issues do happen, and they need to be investigated. So I think that's really important. Again, I'll push Josh's op-ed today in the Washington Times. If you haven't read it, go and check it out. One of the other issues I want to bring up is I don't know, interference might be too strong of a word, but these NGOs, this issue of what used to be called the Zuck Bucks, where you have these nonprofit organizations spending a bunch of money to do again seemingly noble purposes of registration and so on, but it seems like the money, or at least the ratio of money where they go in and invest seems to be 10 to 1, 15 to 1 in these Democrat areas compared to the Republican areas.
Deployment.
Yeah, exactly. And so they
Right.
can say, oh yeah, well, we totally went into that conservative county, but we went into these 50 other, more Democratic heavy counties and did more registration there. I think we've solved the problem, Derek, here in Texas. No, haven't solved the problem. So then Josh,
we've solved about half of it, and I don't want to step on Josh's toe, so I'm gonna let him take that away.
Yeah. Have we? Because I know we tried to address it. I'm not sure how far that legislation went, or if it was included in the big bill that ultimately passed. Are we secure here in that area in Texas? And what about other states?
Well, I would say this, we're getting there, like Derek said. So the issue with Zuck Bucks is that a lot of states did a great thing and passed Zuck Bucks bans, right? They passed third-party money going to influence elections. The problem is certain entities are still working around that ban to try to get money into the election system. I mean, we saw it in DeKalb County, Georgia, this past year, and the Georgia legislature has had to go and pass another level of a Zuck Bucks ban because the entity was just trying to go around what was there in the first place. So I don't think you're seeing an end to this yet. It's not perfect. There's a lot of studies happening out there about entities that are still trying to penetrate our governmental systems. One thing that I want to emphasize, though, that a lot of people aren't talking about is, we always talk about the money that is used to buy infrastructure that could benefit one party or the other. The other thing that people get when they accept Zuck Bucks dollars, though, is they get access. Right? The other side is buying access to be part of the election system. And going back to Bucks County, part of the reason we chose that, it was Politico wrote an article about Bucks County over the summer. And some of the candidates said, if we don't win this race, then the elections in 2024 are going to be run under Republican rules. What's the opposite of that? Whose rules are you running them under? And so one thing that we're really trying to advocate for is making sure that there's even access or clear access to the election system on both sides. So we still have a lot of work to do on Zuck Bucks. The bans that have been in place are great. People are still trying to work around those, but we also need to pay attention to the access and who is actually working our elections from the outside.
You probably, I'm going to say, because we obviously, we're inside baseball kind of podcast, but Josh, I want to give you the opportunity to actually explain what Zuck Bucks are and kind of how the etymology there works, how to come about that name.
Sure. Thanks, Derek. So Zuck Bucks are named after the famous or infamous Mark Zuckerberg, depending on how you look at that. He funded organizations in the 2020 election to upwards of $500 million almost. And he provided this infrastructure to certain election jurisdictions under the guise of, we want to give you extra money so that you can run a proper election under everything that was happening through COVID, right? What we found out afterwards, though, was that this money was rarely spent to actually on what it was meant for, on COVID precautions. It was spent to expand election infrastructure that was really used to benefit one political party. And the studies that came out afterwards on both where the money went, to what we talked about earlier, and how it was spent was really shocking to a lot of people. It was a level of outside influence on our elections that our country has never seen before. Its magnitude was absolutely incredible. I mean, $500 million targeted to certain counties across the country was just amazing. And we saw the results of what happened, the confusion that it caused. And what we've seen afterwards is a real desire by states to get rid of these third parties participating in the election process. No matter what side you're for, this should be an even process. The government should probably run it. It should be a main function of government is to run a free, fair, and safe election. And we don't need other parties participating with their dollars or their infrastructure.
Well, I mean, it'd be very similar if, say, Sheldon Adelson's estate went and started funding, the conservative areas around Philadelphia to strengthen those voting precincts.
Right. Yeah. Sure. And I'm always curious to know, like, because for someone who's so careful with his image, Mark Zuckerberg, I wonder how he reacted to the fact that there's this Zuck Bucks thing that's out there, based on his, or if it was, intentional at all. Not to be conspiratorial, but it's always curious to see if how he would have reacted to that. So a couple more things while we have just a couple more minutes left. Quick rapid fire, just because these are some hot button issues. I want you to maybe address all at once. One is, voter suppression. I mean, there's been a lot of new reforms that people have claimed, across the states that are going to, reduce the number of voting or reduce turnout, particularly in certain areas. Have you seen any of that? I mean, is there any evidence that any of these reforms have driven voter turnout to new low levels or anything like that?
No, absolutely not. In fact, it's been the exact opposite. In Texas, where we're located, and then in my home state of Georgia, they passed the two most significant election integrity bills last cycle. And they've actually seen an increase in voter participation. So there's no correlation at all between the passage of election integrity bills, right? Tightening the election integrity infrastructure in a state, and voter suppression.
So,
In
so
fact,
we can fully rule out Jim Pterodactyl or whatever we're on now.
whichever bird it is. And then from
That's
the
right.
left and from the far right, a lot of people saying, well, there's got to be a lot of illegal immigrants voting, and millions of people coming across, these loose rules about who can vote and show up, and all these issues at the ballot box. Is there any significant issue that you see with potentially illegals voting in our elections?
Well, I will say the issue is more with voting rolls generally, right? There's a lot that needs to be done to clean up our voter rolls across the country. The problem is it's a really difficult operation. States have different laws about cleaning up voter rolls. You can technically live in another state, but vote in a state if you keep your residency there. So it's a lot more complex than a lot of people think it is. Mm-hmm. But there are a lot of common sense matters that can be done to clean up the voter rolls. And I would say that's something that states need to focus on, but it's a big challenge and it's not going to be fixed overnight.
Well, Josh, we've had a lot of fun today. We really appreciate you being on here. Very illuminating as we get into the election season and then eventually into the silly season, as they call it, next year. So we'll probably have you back at some point to see how it's going, because these efforts are ongoing and we're trying to get reforms and reports and things done in these states. So we'd love to have you back to kind of see how it's going, maybe sometime after the primaries to see how the effort is succeeding.
Great. I really appreciate it. There's a lot of work to be done on election integrity, but I want people to have confidence in their vote, and that's what we're working toward.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And thank you, the viewers and the listeners, again, for watching. If you have any comments, feedback, or if you have any show ideas, of course, you can reach Derek and I both on X or Twitter or whatever the heck we're calling it this week.
I refuse to change.
Yeah, maybe on the MySpace. I think Derek still has a profile there.
Tom's in my top 8.
So thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. And as always, as we like to close, the Sam Houston quote: "Do good and risk the consequences." We'll see you next time.